Ethan Carter shifted uneasily in the passenger seat of his old hatchback, watching the streets blur past in late afternoon light. He had been looking forward to this visit all week, yet now, sitting here, the anticipation was tangled with a subtle nervousness he couldn't shake. Logan Hayes, his best friend since high school, had insisted he come over for a casual hangout, but Ethan had an odd sense that this visit would be different. Something about Logan's tone over the phone hinted at a liveliness he couldn't place. "Relax, man," Logan's voice cut through his thoughts, cheerful and unbothered. "It's just me, you, and a few people I promised to show around the neighborhood. Nothing crazy." Ethan forced a laugh, though it felt hollow in his chest. "Yeah, sure. Nothing crazy." The words repeated themselves in his mind like a mantra, trying to ward off the subtle tension coiling there. He had always admired Logan's confidence, the ease with which he could charm anyone he met, and somewhere beneath that admiration, something warmer, more complicated, had begun to grow. Pulling into Logan's driveway, Ethan noticed immediately that the scene wasn't quite what he had expected. Logan's cousins were there, two young men Ethan had never met before. One of them, Micah Reynolds, stood by the front door, leaning casually against the frame with a half-smile that seemed to know something he hadn't yet discovered. The other, Dylan Reynolds, was inside, glimpsed through the window, moving with a quiet, almost unreadable grace that made Ethan's curiosity tighten like a coil. Logan waved as Ethan stepped out of the car, his smile broad and easy. "Ethan. Glad you could make it. Guys, this is Ethan, my best friend." Micah's grin widened. "Nice to meet you, Ethan. Logan's told me a lot about you." There was a playfulness in his tone, an underlying challenge that made Ethan's pulse quicken without understanding why. Dylan followed, his nod polite but his eyes lingering just a fraction too long, studying Ethan as though weighing him, measuring something unspoken. Inside, the house smelled faintly of fresh coffee and warm pastry, a comforting contrast to the flutter of nerves Ethan felt. Logan guided him toward the living room, and Ethan noticed the casual familiarity with which Micah and Dylan moved through the space, as if they had claimed it long ago. Conversation flowed easily, laughter punctuating the room, yet Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of being observed in subtle, disarming ways. "You're quiet," Micah said suddenly, leaning on the back of the sofa near Ethan. "Not your usual self, are you?" His voice was light, teasing, but there was an intensity underneath, a sense of curiosity that felt almost magnetic. Ethan shrugged, unsure of what to say. "Just, taking it all in. New faces, I guess." He felt the weight of Dylan's gaze from across the room, the silent observation making him self-conscious. Logan, oblivious to the tension threading through Ethan's awareness, laughed. "You're overthinking it. They're just visiting me for a few days. Don't worry, they're friendly." Friendly. The word echoed oddly in Ethan's mind. Friendly was easy. What was happening in this room felt different. Each glance, each small smile from Micah, seemed charged with an unspoken energy. And Dylan's quiet presence, the way he leaned slightly toward the group while maintaining a certain distance, suggested he was watching, waiting, perhaps even assessing. Ethan poured himself a glass of water, his hands shaking slightly despite the casual setting. He caught Micah's eyes across the room, and for a moment, the playful grin softened into something warmer, more personal. The connection was fleeting, barely noticeable to anyone else, but to Ethan, it carried weight. The kind of weight that made him question boundaries, both his own and Logan's. As the afternoon moved on, conversation shifted from casual topics, college experiences, favorite movies, weekend plans, to more personal anecdotes. Micah shared a story about an impromptu road trip he had taken, full of humor and slightly daring choices. Ethan found himself drawn in, laughing freely, noticing the way Micah's eyes twinkled when he spoke. The attention felt intoxicating, a contrast to the comfort he had always felt with Logan alone. Dylan remained quieter, but his presence was felt keenly. Ethan caught him in moments where he would glance toward Logan and Micah with a faintly critical eye, then quickly look away as if ashamed to be caught observing. There was a tension between the cousins, subtle yet undeniable, and Ethan felt himself pulled into it, a willing participant in a dynamic he didn't fully understand. Logan suddenly called out, clapping his hands together. Hey, why don't we step outside? The evening's perfect for some fresh air. Ethan nodded, though his thoughts were still caught on the lingering looks, the almost imperceptible touches, brushing hands, playful nudges, whispered comments he could only half-hear. As they moved toward the backyard, Ethan felt a strange mix of anticipation and unease. Micah's arm brushed his briefly as they stepped through the doorway, and the contact, innocent as it might have been, sent a ripple of heat through him. Dylan followed a few steps behind, silent, his expression unreadable, yet his eyes never left Ethan. The sky had softened into shades of pink and gold, and the backyard was bathed in the warm glow of late afternoon. Laughter continued, casual jokes and playful teasing, but Ethan's mind was elsewhere. He was aware of the pull between familiarity and temptation, between loyalty and curiosity. The air felt charged with unspoken possibilities, and he realized, with a mixture of fear and thrill, that this visit would change something he hadn't expected. Micah caught Ethan's gaze across the yard, a subtle smile curving his lips. He raised his hand slightly in greeting, a gesture small enough for Logan to miss but large enough for Ethan to feel its weight. In that instant, Ethan knew this afternoon would not be ordinary. Something had shifted, quietly, invisibly, in the space between them, and just as Ethan felt the tension peak, Micah leaned closer and said something under his breath, almost inaudible, that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. "We should talk later, just you and me." Ethan's heart raced. The invitation was simple, the words few, yet it carried a charge he couldn't ignore. Logan laughed nearby, oblivious to the stirrings of attraction, the tension weaving itself silently through the evening. Ethan knew, even before he responded, that the rest of the day would test boundaries he hadn't realized existed. The moment ended with a subtle, knowing smile from Micah and a glance from Dylan that seemed almost like a warning. Ethan, caught in the swirl of emotions and possibilities, realized that what had started as a casual visit had transformed into something unpredictable, a delicate web of desire, curiosity, and suspense that he wasn't sure he could navigate. And as he followed the group toward the patio, Ethan felt a thrill he hadn't felt before, the unmistakable sense that nothing would ever be quite the same after this day. Ethan lingered near the patio door, his hand resting lightly on the frame, feeling the warmth of the late afternoon sun fade into the cool shadow of the house. Micah Reynolds had excused himself moments earlier, ostensibly to grab another drink, but Ethan knew the brief exchange in the kitchen wasn't over. There had been something in Micah's gaze, a spark, a teasing edge, that lingered far longer than ordinary politeness required. That he tried to focus on the conversation Logan was having with Dylan about a recent football match, laughter filling the air, but his attention kept drifting. Micah's presence lingered in his mind like a subtle ache, a pull toward curiosity and something unnamed. Dylan's quiet observation added a tension Ethan couldn't ignore. The way Dylan's eyes seemed to note every nuance, every shift in Ethan's posture, made him acutely aware of himself in a way he hadn't expected. Finally, Micah returned, holding 2 glasses of iced tea. "Here," he said, passing one to Ethan. Their fingers brushed briefly, and Ethan felt a jolt, a fleeting, electrical spark that made him swallow hard. "Thanks," he muttered, and their eyes met, lingering just a fraction too long. Micah leaned casually against the counter, the sunlight casting subtle shadows across his face. "You know," he said lightly, "you seem different than I expected." Not in a bad way. His tone carried a warmth that was easy to mistake for friendliness, but Ethan felt the layers beneath it, playfulness, curiosity, perhaps even a challenge. Ethan sipped his drink, suddenly aware of how fast his pulse had risen. "Different how?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though it sounded too high-pitched in his own ears. "You're thoughtful," Micah said with a small, knowing smile. "Observant. Not the type to dive into things blindly." "I like that." The words were casual, but the weight behind them left Ethan momentarily unsteady. He felt a stirring inside him, an unfamiliar tug that he couldn't quite name. Dylan entered the kitchen silently, moving to lean against the wall. He didn't speak, but the intensity of his gaze fixed on Ethan created a quiet, unspoken tension. Ethan shifted, uncomfortable under the scrutiny, but also intrigued. There was a silent dialogue in the room now, a triangle of sorts, with unvoiced meanings dancing just beneath the surface. "You're quiet," Micah teased again, breaking the silence. I like making people talk, drawing them out. It's fun. His smile was inviting, casual, and slightly daring. Ethan laughed, a little nervously, though he didn't want to. He didn't want to admit how drawn he was to the ease with which Micah navigated the room, to the subtle intimacy of their conversation. You do this with everyone? Ethan asked, trying to sound teasing himself, though his heart raced in a way that felt unfamiliar. Micah's grin widened. Not usually. You're different. He raised an eyebrow, and Ethan felt the full weight of the statement, of the unspoken possibilities it suggested. His mind spun with thoughts he barely allowed himself to voice. Different. Interesting. Dangerous. From across the kitchen, Dylan shifted slightly, and Ethan felt the quiet judgment, or was it concern, in the older cousin's glance. Ethan realized that he was the focal point of this subtle tension, a pivot around which attention and desire quietly revolved. He had never experienced anything like it, this mingling of warmth, intrigue, and ethical hesitation. Ethan, Micah said softly, leaning closer. Do you ever feel like there's something more waiting, but you don't know how to reach it? His voice was gentle, almost conspiratorial, and Ethan found himself nodding despite himself. I think about things sometimes, Ethan admitted, his voice low. He tried to mask the rising nervousness that felt like both fear and anticipation. Things I don't always understand. Micah's gaze softened, and he smiled in a way that made Ethan's stomach twist. Maybe it's not about understanding everything right away. Maybe it's about noticing what feels real, what sparks something in you. He tilted his head slightly, the sunlight catching the edge of his hair, creating a halo effect that Ethan couldn't ignore. There was a pause, and then Dylan stepped forward, still quiet, yet impossible to ignore. His eyes met Ethan's briefly, and in that instant, Ethan felt both the weight of judgment and an inexplicable pull, like standing on the edge of something he couldn't yet define. The moment passed quickly, but the impression lingered. Dylan's silent presence added depth to the tension, an unspoken complexity to the room that Ethan couldn't shake. The conversation moved on, but Ethan found himself increasingly aware of the subtleties, the brush of hands, the small tilt of a head, the half-smile shared between the cousins that hinted at inside jokes. Each gesture, each glance, layered the atmosphere with suspense, curiosity, and temptation. Ethan realized he was teetering on the edge of something he couldn't quite articulate, a choice between loyalty to Logan and the stirring of something new, exciting, and uncharted. Micah leaned against the counter, lowering his voice just slightly. We should talk later, just you and me. The words were soft, casual, yet deliberate, and Ethan felt a shiver of anticipation. His mind raced, aware of Logan laughing outside, unaware of the undercurrent building inside the house. Ethan's pulse quickened. The invitation was simple, almost innocent, but it carried a weight he couldn't ignore. He glanced at Dylan, whose eyes were fixed on him for a brief, unreadable moment. There was caution there, or perhaps a silent warning, he couldn't tell which. Yeah, Ethan murmured, uncertain. His mind was a swirl of emotions, excitement, guilt, curiosity, and fear, all tangled together. He knew that whatever happened next would not just change the evening, it could alter the delicate balance of his relationships forever. Logan's laughter floated through the open patio door, warm and carefree, unaware of the tension simmering inside. Ethan took a slow breath, trying to steady himself, but the pull of what Micah had suggested lingered, a quiet siren call at the edge of his conscience. He realized then that this wasn't about physicality, it was about attention, connection, and discovery. The emotional charge, the subtle flotation, the magnetism of unspoken possibilities, was enough to make him question everything he thought he understood about desire, loyalty, and identity. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor. Ethan took one last look at Micah, whose gaze met his with a knowing intensity, and then at Dylan, whose eyes still watched silently from across the room. In that moment, Ethan understood that the day had irrevocably shifted. Something new, fragile, and dangerous had begun, and he had no clear idea where it would lead. And as he stepped toward the doorway, following Logan and the others outside, Ethan felt the unmistakable thrill of anticipation, an awareness that the boundaries he once thought unbreakable were now blurred, and that the rest of the evening would test his feelings in ways he wasn't yet prepared to face.